The red wine fell like a blade. The sharp sound of glass striking the table cut through the golden air of the Hudson Crown Hotel ballroom, where America's financial elite had gathered beneath million-dollar chandeliers. In the space of a single breath, the gala turned into an arena, and the woman at its center had never wanted to be the spectacle. Aisha Carter, 38 years old, CEO of Vector Solutions. The first black woman ever to close a technology deal worth $2.4 billion with the Whitmore Group sat at the head table. What had just spilled over her shoulder was not a toast, but an entire glass of rich Bordeaux, dark and thick as blood, soaking into the emerald silk of her gown. The one who had done it smiled. Lydia Whitmore. 32, the only sister of Billionaire Grant, Whitmore Wall Street's golden prince, lifted her chin with icy grace, the light glinting off her blade blue eyes. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice sweet and cutting. "My hand slipped, I suppose. Red suits you better than green." The entire room seemed to freeze. The violin stopped mid-note. Conversations and laughter halted in their throats. Every eye turned not out of sympathy, but hunger, because in rooms like these, the fall of power is the favorite entertainment. Aisha didn't stand. She said nothing. She simply tilted her head slightly, letting the red wine trace a slow path down her neck, across her collarbone, seeping into the fabric. It was sticky cold and stung her skin. Yet what rose inside her was not humiliation. It was stillness. Dangerous stillness. A waiter rushed forward, but she lifted a hand gently. "It's fine," she said, her voice low, calm, and steady enough to make people shiver. Across the table, Lydia laughed, a bright, hollow sound. "Relax, honey," she said, raising her empty glass like a trophy. "It's just a little wine. Don't be so serious." The younger guests laughed with her brittle laughter that sounded like cracking glass. Phones came up, cameras began recording lenses, feeding on the scene. In the white glow of countless screens, Aisha saw clearly just how addicted this world was to witnessing someone's downfall. A senator's wife covered her mouth and whispered, "How cruel," but she didn't stand. No one did. Lydia turned her silver gown, shimmering like liquid light. She looked down at Aisha and said, "You know, my sister once told me not everyone should sit at this table. Some seats are reserved for those born to them." A laugh rose from a nearby table, then another, spreading like a small fire across the gold-plated hall, filling the air with arrogance and restrained shame. Aisha stayed silent. She placed one hand on the table, her fingertips wet with wine, but not trembling. In her mind, flashes of the morning replayed the handshake with Grant Whitmore, before the press, his charming but condescending smile, his words, "Welcome to the real world." And now she was in that real world, a world where people like Lydia believed power was inherited and respect was a privilege reserved for white skin. The air grew thick. Someone sighed. Someone pretended to check their phone. A few men in tuxedos whispered, "Who is she?" "Aisha Carter, CEO of Vector, the one who signed with the Whitmores this morning." Good Lord, Aisha heard every word, but didn't react. Only her eyes, deep, calm, and unflinching, locked on Lydia's. That single gaze, long and sharp, cut through Lydia's carefully constructed smile. The laughter faltered. Lydia's lips twitched, but for the briefest moment, her confidence cracked. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a faint tremor, the kind that comes before the ground gives way beneath your feet. A minute passed, then another. Everyone waited for a slap, for a scream, for anything, but none came. Only Aisha's silence remained so profound that the room could hear its own heartbeat. "Don't you have anything to say?" Lydia asked, her voice pitched high, desperate to reclaim the attention slipping away. Aisha merely shrugged, a thin smile flickering across her lips, sharp as a blade. No one could tell if it was forgiveness or the beginning of a war. Outside the glass windows, Manhattan gleamed, its towers of finance glittering like diamonds. Somewhere out there, billions were being moved with a single signature, and inside this room, under 100 stares, another kind of power was quietly changing hands. Lydia raised her empty glass again, forcing a laugh that only she still found amusing. "Cheers, everyone, to those who know their place." Scattered laughter followed, but no one laughed with conviction. Aisha looked at her own glass, water clear and still. She lifted it gently, the crystal catching the chandelier's light, reflecting across her composed face like steel. There was no need for words, no need for rage. In that instant, everyone understood the real battle wouldn't be fought at this table. It would take place in boardrooms, in contracts, in the unseen spaces where fate is decided. Wine could stain a dress, but it could never taint dignity. And that night, as the music died and the crystal lights shimmered like falling snow, a woman drenched in wine began to rewrite the definition of power. No one in the room knew exactly what was happening. They only knew that the air, once filled with laughter, had turned heavy and thick, as if everyone were breathing through glass. The string quartet in the corner tried to resume Moon River, but managed only a few trembling notes before falling silent again. Aisha Carter sat at the center of the head table, her emerald gown darkened to the color of shadow. Her bronze skin shimmered faintly beneath the chandelier light, reflecting off the Bordeaux that dripped down her collar, a strange shade of red, half humiliation, half blood. But in the eyes of everyone present, she was no longer the victim. She had become a stillness that seemed to swallow the entire room. Lydia Whitmore stood slightly to the right, holding an empty crystal glass that gleamed under the lights. Her face tried to maintain pride, but she could feel something slipping off balance. The crowd was no longer looking at her with admiration. They were looking at Aisha, and in their gaze was something Lydia could not stand respect. She forced a laugh, her voice unnaturally high, trying to shatter the silence that unnerved her. "Oh, come on, everyone, don't be so serious. A little wine isn't a crime." "She's fine, right, Miss Carter?" It was a hollow question, but in that silence, it rang painfully sharp. Aisha didn't answer. She simply looked up, her eyes, slow and deep, a gaze so steady that Lydia instinctively took half a step back. At the table to the left, an older couple exchanged uneasy looks. The husband, Richard Hale, one of the Whitmore Group's long-time investors, leaned toward his wife and whispered, "This doesn't look good, Margaret. That's the CEO of Vector Solutions." "The contract this morning," his wife replied softly, eyes fixed on Lydia. The girls gone too far. Their voices were low, but in a room stripped of laughter, every word rang like metal. The younger guests, heirs and heiresses of old money, tried to force awkward smiles. One young man spoke his tone forcedly light. "She should be grateful. That's Bordeaux from 2012, worth more than her dress." The laughter that followed was thin and short, lived dying the instant Aisha turned her head. It wasn't an angry look. It was a look that made people ashamed. Aisha didn't need to speak. She simply exhaled slowly, resting her hand on the white tablecloth. Her fingers glistened with wine, her nails polished clear steady beneath the chandelier's glow. Inside, she heard her own voice whispering, "Stay calm, Aisha. You don't win by arguing. You win through the silence of others." Lydia still didn't understand. She thought silence meant surrender, that refusing to react meant acceptance. What she didn't know was that with every passing second, Aisha's composure was turning into a blade. A young waiter, pale and trembling, moved toward her with a napkin, but Aisha shook her head gently. "Don't." "Thank you." He froze, then stepped back quickly, as if he'd just been pardoned. At the center of the room, Lydia began to fidget. She leaned against her chair and smirked. Strange, isn't it? I've never seen anyone just sit there after being doused in wine. Or maybe you're too scared to respond. Still no answer. Only the light reflecting on Aisha's face, making her skin seem almost luminous. At another table, two financial directors exchanged sharp glances. "You think this will affect the deal from this morning?" one murmured. "If it were me, I'd cancel immediately," the other replied. No one wants to partner with someone who humiliates their business ally on camera. Another voice joined in. Everyone's recording this. By tomorrow, this will be all over the financial channels. Aisha knew that. She knew that every phone lifted toward her wasn't just capturing a moment of humiliation, it was recording evidence. Evidence of a world that had turned cruelty into entertainment. She took a deep breath. The Bordeaux was still warm on her neck, but what boiled inside her wasn't rage. It was a cold certainty this wasn't failure. It was a test. At the head of the table, Grant Whitmore, Lydia's brother, and the owner of Whitmore Capital, had just returned after greeting a few politicians. He stopped seeing his sister standing at the center with an empty glass, and Aisha drenched in red. "Lydia, what's going on?" "Nothing." "Grant," Lydia answered quickly, her voice bright. "Just a little accident. Miss Carter's fine." Grant looked around. The guest's eyes avoided his. He knew fine was a lie. Aisha looked up, meeting his gaze. For a fleeting second he saw something startling, not anger, but pure, absolute stillness, the kind that only appears in someone preparing to do the unthinkable. He opened his mouth to apologize for his sister, but Aisha spoke first, smiling faintly. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Whitmore. I understand some people are still learning how to control their wine glasses." Her words were soft, but every ear in the ballroom heard them. Lydia's face flushed crimson. Grant froze, and the guests went utterly silent. Aisha's calm was no longer defense. It had become a weapon, a mirror reflecting everyone else's smallness. She turned to a nearby waiter and said gently, "Would you bring me a glass of water, please?" Her tone was polite, but something in it made the young man's hands tremble. The glass was placed before her. Aisha lifted it, the crystal catching the chandelier's light. She took a slow sip, then set it back down. A small gesture, yet the sound of the glass touching the linen echoed through the room. Lydia forced a laugh. "Oh, so you're calm enough to drink water? Impressive." No one laughed with her. Her voice hung in the air, awkward and hollow, slipping away like a stone dropped into water without a splash. Then something strange happened. The cameras still pointed at Aisha, but no one looked at her with pity anymore. The eyes that watched her now held something else, quiet reverence. In the corners of the room, a few wealthy women exchanged glances and nodded subtly. One whispered, "She's different." And she was. In a night where everyone wore masks, only the humiliated woman was real. Aisha sat there, wine still dripping onto the marble floor, each drop marking the countdown to an explosion no one saw coming. Above her, The grand chandelier blazed, but its light seemed to shift, no longer shining on Lydia. It illuminated the drenched woman below. A cool gust swept through the vents. People shivered, though they couldn't say why. Deep down, they all felt it. The storm had just begun, and its name was Aisha Carter. The sound inside the Hudson Crown Ballroom had changed. It was no longer music nor laughter, but the quiet noise of hundreds of thoughts shifting all at once. Everyone could feel it. Something invisible had turned. Aisha Carter still sat there. The Bordeaux had dried on her bronze skin, its dark red now resembling a wound. Yet her face showed no trace of pain. Her hands rested still on the table, straight, steady, proud, like a bronze statue, standing firm in the storm. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to justify herself. Her very presence was enough to change the air. Eyes began to turn toward her, not out of curiosity, but drawn by something magnetic, the power of a woman who refused to bow. Across the room, Lydia Whitmore tried to smile, but the smile was stiff, her lips trembling, the light in her eyes fading. She could feel it. The light in the room was leaving her. Desperate to regain control, Lydia raised her voice, forcing cheer into the silence. "Come on, everyone. We're here to celebrate, not to turn anyone into a martyr. She's just a business partner. Don't make it so dramatic." A few weak laughs answered her, but no one looked her way. Some guests turned aside, looking for an excuse to leave the table. A middle-aged man sipped his wine, avoiding Lydia's gaze. He didn't want to be associated with a performance spiraling out of control. Aisha observed all of it, not with satisfaction, but with a calm so absolute it was chilling. Inside her mind, a voice spoke clearly. They've chosen a side, and it isn't hers. From the corner of the room, Richard Hale, the seasoned investor who had whispered to his wife earlier, leaned toward a young businessman beside him. "You know what's at stake," he murmured. "In the Vector Whitmore deal this morning, Vector holds the veto power. If Ms. Carter withdraws her signature, $2.4 billion vanish into thin air." The young man's eyes widened. "Good God, then that means the Whitmore girl just threw her family's future into a glass of Bordeaux." The words spread faster than music. The glances toward Lydia now carried a mixture of shock and fear. Grant Whitmore, her brother, and the head of Whitmore Capital, finally grasped the magnitude of the disaster. He frowned and stepped away from the group of politicians walking toward the central table. His steps were heavy, not from anger, but from dread. Lydia spotted him and forced a shaky laugh. "Grant, you're just in time. It was only a joke." Who knew she'd take it so seriously? Grant looked at his sister like a man staring at a child who had set fire to a fuel tank. "You just insulted the person who holds 70% of the control over today's contract." "That little joke," he said, "coldly could collapse the entire company." The words struck like a hammer. Everyone heard them. Lydia's face drained of color. Aisha remained silent, but within that silence, there was energy, the kind that belongs to someone who decides when the storm begins. A phone rang, piercing the air like a siren. A young man in a grey suit looked at his screen, then went pale. Internal update. Vector just suspended the announcement of their partnership with Whitmore Capital. The murmurs erupted like thunder. "That can't be. She hasn't even said a word." "Wait, is she?" Grant turned to Aisha, his voice rough and low. "Miss Carter, I apologize on my sister's behalf. If there's anything I can do to make this right." Aisha set her glass of water down gently as though laying down a verdict. "You don't need to apologize for anyone, Mr. Whitmore. Everyone is responsible for their own actions. I'm sure you of all people understand that." Grant fell silent. He knew he had already lost, not a negotiation, but a lesson in dignity. Lydia forced a brittle laugh, shards of glass in her voice. "You're threatening me over a little wine." "How fragile." Aisha turned to her. "No, I'm not threatening you. I'm showing you consequences. Sometimes consequences cost more than wine." Each word fell like metal. No one dared to interrupt. At a nearby table, a financial reporter unlocked her phone. The screen lit up. Breaking Vector Solutions reconsiders $2.4 billion partnership after public incident at Whitmore Gala. She looked up, wide-eyed. Oh my God, it's already hit the news. The room exploded. Chairs scraped, whispers spread like wildfire. Some guests rushed outside to take calls. Those who had laughed at Aisha earlier now kept their heads low, unable to meet her eyes. Lydia began to panic for real. She looked around for allies, but none remained. "Grant, say something. You're the one who signed the deal." Grant didn't look at her. He was already on the phone, his voice low and heavy as stone. "Freeze all PR campaigns. Until I say otherwise." Aisha stayed seated. She didn't need to command anyone, didn't need to raise her voice. With nothing but composure, she had made the most powerful people in the room move in her wake. Then she stood. The motion was small, yet the entire ballroom fell silent. The click of her heels against the marble echoed firm and deliberate. Every gaze followed her. She didn't apologize. She didn't demand justice. She simply straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin as if the entire room already belonged to her. The Bordeaux stains had dried into dark streaks, but instead of shame, they made her look like a warrior walking off a battlefield, bloodied but unbroken. Somewhere someone sighed. A woman whispered, "She doesn't need to speak. She's already won." Lydia looked around, desperate. Her eyes met those of a close friend, but the woman quickly looked away, pretending to check her phone. Loneliness hit her like a wave of ice. Aisha stopped facing her. "You know, Lydia," she said softly, her voice slow and resonant, like the toll of a steel bell. "I used to think power was something people were born with. But tonight, I learned something else. True power belongs only to those calm enough not to lose themselves in a crowd." The entire ballroom held its breath. Lydia stood trembling with rage, but no words came. Because among hundreds of powerful people, she was now the smallest of them all. Aisha turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing like the ticking of a clock, counting down to an earthquake Lydia couldn't yet comprehend. She didn't know that in just a few hours, the termination order would shake the markets, Whitmore Capital's stocks would plummet, and the name Aisha Carter would dominate every front page in America. But right now in the Hudson Crown Ballroom, no one spoke about numbers. They spoke about a woman who had been drenched in wine and had turned the stain itself into a crown. The news spread faster than the heartbeat of anyone in the room. A minute earlier, the Hudson Crown had been the site of a glamorous gala for the financial elite. A minute later, it had become the epicenter of a media earthquake. Phones lit up across the ballroom like a forest of lightning in the night. Notifications poured in. Breaking News Vector Solutions suspends a $2.4 billion partnership with Whitmore Capital. The once lively room now felt drained of air. No one spoke, but everyone understood this was not an accident. This was a catastrophe. Lydia Whitmore was frozen in place. Her hand clenched the empty glass so tightly her nails pressed white against the crystal. She looked around, hoping for a friendly face, but found only eyes that looked away, some even filled with fear. No one was willing to stand with her now. And Aisha Carter. She sat still, calm as a mirror, her dark eyes reflecting the chaos swirling around her. She didn't need to lift a finger. Power this time came to her on its own. A single ding sounded from a nearby table. A young man stared at his phone, his face pale. Whitmore Capital stock just dropped 4% in 6 minutes. Another voice chimed in, trembling. The night market in London opened early. The news has already reached there. All eyes turned toward Grant Whitmore. He stood motionless in the center of the room, his face expressionless, but his eyes revealed the collapse forming inside him. In that instant, the man once called the master of the market looked like a child who had dropped something that could never be picked up again. Grant, Lydia called weakly, her voice cracking, desperate like a child pleading for mercy. Shut up. 2 words quiet but thunderous. The crowded room fell into a silence so deep one could hear the pounding of someone's heart. A guest tried to force a smile, raising his glass in a weak attempt to break the tension, but his hand shook so badly the wine nearly spilled. Others quickly excused themselves, mumbling about taking phone calls. The glittering gowns drifted past like ghosts. In the corner, the orchestra remained seated, no one daring to play a note. A young violinist looked toward Aisha, his expression caught between fear and awe. He knew that tonight that woman had just redefined the meaning of power. Lydia couldn't take it anymore. She rushed toward Aisha, her voice trembling, yet still laced with pride. Do you think you can destroy the Whitmore family with a single phone call? Who do you think you are? Aisha looked up, her eyes, neither angry nor cold, but calm, terrifyingly calm. I'm not destroying anything, she said, her voice low and steady. I'm simply stopping. Lydia's breath caught. That word stopping was simple, but it landed like a sentence. Aisha rose slowly. The stains of Bordeaux on her gown had dried into dark red patterns that looked like petals. Her steps were soft, but each click of her heels on the marble floor sent a shiver through the crowd. Grant stepped forward. Aisha, listen to me. I know this is unforgivable, and I'll take responsibility. But this deal, you know it's bigger than us. Thousands of employees, investors. Yes, she interrupted, and unfortunately, they just witnessed how your people treat a partner in public. Those thousands deserve better leadership. Her tone wasn't loud, but every word hit the air like weight. Behind her, whispers rippled through the room. She's not just pulling out her investment. She's going to bring the whole system down. A perfect move, ruthless, but fair. A woman in a crimson gown leaned toward her friend and whispered, I used to think only men could shake the market. Now I'm not so sure. Hidden among the crowd, several people quietly switched on their recorders. They knew they were witnessing history. Lydia stood frozen, her face pale. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Her world power reputation money was melting like wax. And in front of her, the woman who had been drenched in wine stood tall, silent, and more commanding than anyone in the room. Aisha didn't look at Lydia again. She turned to Grant, her tone soft, but sharp as steel. I'm not retaliating out of anger. I'm reminding you there are things money can't buy. Respect is one of them. Grant lowered his head. That small gesture was enough to confirm what everyone already knew. The balance of power had shifted. In that moment, the entire room seemed suspended in the silence between them. A silence that didn't hold humiliation, but awakening. Aisha took a deep breath, then spoke quietly. Power doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who stays calm when the whole room laughs at them. She stepped away from the table, walking slowly. The guests in the front rows rose unconsciously, not knowing why, only that it felt right, as if instinctively recognizing something worthy of reverence. An older man, his voice thick with emotion, whispered, "My God, I've never seen anyone turn humiliation into power like that." Grant turned to see his sister standing, motionless, eyes red. "You've just turned our family's grand gala into a funeral," he said quietly. "Not for her. For us." Lydia began to cry, her tears mixing with the faint traces of wine on her hands, the bitter taste of defeat. Aisha stopped near the entrance. The light from the hallway cast a soft glow around her. She turned back, not at Lydia, not at Grant, but at everyone. There are nights when silence speaks louder than 1,000 excuses. And tonight I think everyone has heard enough. She walked out. The glass doors closed behind her, leaving the ballroom in utter silence, broken only by the shallow breaths of those who had just realized they were standing on a collapsing empire. Outside, the New York night was freezing, but inside Aisha's chest there was warmth, not of victory, but of freedom. She had not lost control. She had not lowered herself, and through composure alone she had made an empire bow. In the city that never sleeps tonight, one woman no longer needed dreams, because she had turned her own humiliation into a medal. 7 o'clock the next morning. Wall Street was still half asleep, yet the air was already thick with tension, like fog before a storm. The massive LED screens outside Bloomberg Tower flashed a single headline in bold red vector solutions: "Withdraws from $2.4 billion partnership with Whitmore Capital after gala incident." The news spread like wildfire. Financial networks from New York to London, from Tokyo to Singapore, repeated the same name, Aisha Carter. One night, just one night, and the entire American financial world had turned upside down. Inside Whitmore Capital's headquarters on the 42nd floor overlooking the Hudson River, Grant Whitmore stood by the window, his fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. Below his company's stock was in free fall, every red number, a cut across the pride he had built over 15 years. His assistant's voice trembled as he reported market value down over $600 million in the first 3 hours of trading, sir. Investors are demanding an official statement. Grant closed his eyes. In his head, he still heard echoes of the night before Lydia's laughter, Aisha's calm gaze, and those final words, "Power doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room." For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose control. Meanwhile, in Midtown Manhattan, the Vector Solutions office was bathed in quiet morning light. Aisha Carter stepped out of the elevator alone, without a bodyguard or an assistant. Every employee turned to watch her, admiration, pride, and awe mixed in their eyes. A young woman from the PR department exclaimed, "Ms. Carter, social media is exploding. The hashtag #DignityOverDeals is trending #1 worldwide on Twitter." Aisha smiled faintly. "That's not a campaign. That's a lesson." She walked into the conference room. On the table lay piles of documents, market reports, letters from investors, and one email from Whitmore Capital request to renegotiate urgent. Aisha read it, but didn't respond. She set it aside, her gaze drifting to the window. The New York sky that morning was clear and blue sunlight gleaming across silver towers like silent witnesses to a changing era. "We don't need them anymore," she murmured to herself. "We'll reinvest the funds into the Community Startup Fund, a place where people are valued by their ability, not their last name." A senior director stared at her eyes widening. "You're really withdrawing the entire $2.4 billion, Aisha," nodded gently. "If the world only remembers me for that deal, then I'm not worthy of who I am." Outside, journalists began crowding at the foot of the Vector building. A CNBC reporter shouted when she caught a glimpse of Aisha's silhouette through the glass above. "That's the woman who made Wall Street bow with a single sentence." By noon, the U.S. financial markets witnessed something unprecedented. Vector's stock surged 19% in 4 hours, while Whitmore Capital plummeted 31%, triggering a massive sell-off among investors. Across forums and news panels, people couldn't stop talking. She did the right thing. This isn't just economics, it's corporate ethics. The way she sat there in silence and then walked out, I've never seen power like that. The New York Times ran the headline, "Aisha Carter, the woman who didn't raise her voice, but made the world listen." In her private office, Aisha stood before a glass case. The emerald gown she wore the night before hung inside with faint Bordeaux stains, still visible on the shoulder. She hadn't sent it for cleaning. It wasn't a blemish. It was a symbol. She remembered the moment Lydia poured the wine over her head, the sharp smell, the mocking laughter, the cold shock down her spine. If she had stood up and argued that night, things might have gone differently. But she had chosen silence, and that silence had become her sharpest weapon. A knock at the door. Her assistant entered quietly. "Ms. Carter, Mr. Grant Whitmore is in the lobby. He wants to see you." Aisha turned her face, calm as ever. "Send him up." Grant stepped in, looking 10 years older than the night before. His expensive grey suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened. He stopped in front of her desk, forcing a faint smile that couldn't hide his defeat. "Aisha," he began hoarsely, "I'm not here to justify anything. I came to say thank you." Aisha tilted her head slightly. "Thank you. Thank you for teaching me what hundreds of board meetings never could. We built an empire on profit, but you built yours on dignity. And in the end, you won." She didn't smile. "No one won, Mr. Whitmore. There are only those who learned something and those who haven't yet." He fell silent, then sighed. "I'll handle Lydia." "I know an apology isn't enough," Aisha interrupted softly. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to everyone who learned from her that this was how you could treat another human being." Grant lowered his head, then left. When the door closed, Aisha turned back to the window, watching the endless river of cars below. Life went on, but she knew that from this day forward, more women would walk into cold boardrooms with their heads held higher. As evening fell, light rain began to mist over the city. Raindrops slid down the glass, blending with the amber glow of sunset, creating soft streaks that looked like spilled wine. Aisha picked up the phone and called her legal advisor. "Prepare a press conference. I'm announcing the Dignity Initiative, a fund to support women entrepreneurs and fight discrimination in business. Use the entire amount we withdrew from Whitmore. Are you sure that's a lot of money, I'm sure? Because real value isn't in the numbers. It's in how we make others feel seen." She set the phone down, her eyes shining with quiet determination. That night, the world watched live as Aisha Carter stepped onto a stage. No evening gown, no jewelry, just a simple black suit. She stood before the cameras and spoke slowly. Someone once poured wine over me to prove their power. But I chose not to respond in kind, because true power doesn't need proof. It only needs to stay where it belongs in one's self-respect. The audience rose to their feet, the applause swelling like waves crashing ashore. Somewhere across the city, Lydia sat before her television, her face pale. Each clap echoed like a blade cutting into her pride, but also marked the beginning of a lesson she had never been taught, that no one can pour wine on another's dignity unless they are allowed to. The rain kept falling outside. Traffic lights shimmered along Fifth Avenue like the city's glowing veins. And at the heart of Manhattan, a woman sat quietly in her office, sipping her coffee, her gaze distant. Not savoring victory, but listening to the echo of a story that had already become legend, the story of a woman who turned humiliation into strength and silence into a declaration. 3 days after the press conference, the city still hadn't cooled down. Every headline from tabloids to international publications carried the same name, Aisha Carter. She was no longer the victim of the wine incident at the Hudson Crown, but the woman who redefined power in the modern era. Across platforms, the video of her speech surpassed 200 million views. Millions of comments poured in. She doesn't need to shout to be heard. A woman calmer than the entire system. Dignity isn't weakness, it's armor. On Wall Street, people began calling it the Carter effect, a phenomenon where transparency and corporate ethics became vital to every partnership. While Vector Solutions rose as a new symbol of integrity, Whitmore Capital drowned in crisis. Stocks kept plummeting, 2 senior executives resigned, and major investors withdrew en masse. But what truly ignited public outrage wasn't the financial collapse, it was a leaked video from that infamous gala. A waiter had recorded the moment Lydia Whitmore poured wine over Aisha's head. The clip was only 28 seconds long, with no dialogue, just the sound of wine spilling cold laughter and the calm face of the woman being humiliated. Those 28 seconds became an icon, not of scandal, but of dignity. CNN called it the most powerful silence of the decade. In a penthouse on the west side of Manhattan, Lydia sat on her sofa, watching that same clip for the 10th time. Each replay made her feel smaller until she almost disappeared. The room was dark, except for the faint blue light of the TV reflecting off her pale face. The wine glass in her hand trembled. She had never been this silent in her life. Her phone rang endlessly, messages from friends, partners, and admirers who had now turned into strangers. One read, "My advice, stay out of the public eye for at least 6 months." Another, "It's a shame. You should have known the media spares no one." Lydia set the glass down as tears spilled over. She hated Aisha, but deep inside, she knew she wasn't the one who had been destroyed. She had been exposed. She remembered that look from that night, a look without words, yet powerful enough to make her tremble. It wasn't the gaze of anger, but of someone who saw the truth laid bare in another human being. Across the city, Aisha Carter walked into the university where she had received a scholarship at 19. She had been invited to deliver the keynote speech for the School of Economics. Thousands of students filled the auditorium holding signs that read, "Power with Grace," and "Be like Aisha." On stage, she wore a simple white suit, no heavy makeup, no theatrics. Her voice was low, slow, and clear. 3 days ago, someone asked me how it feels to bring down an empire with a single phone call. I told them I didn't bring anyone down. I just stood tall. And when you stand tall, the things built on arrogance will fall on their own. The hall erupted in applause. Some people wiped away tears. Aisha paused, her expression softening. I don't want you to see me as a symbol. I just want you to remember. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the choice of someone who knows their own worth. And when you know who you are, no one can make you bow. This time the applause roared like waves. A young student raised a hand. If you could relive that night, would you do anything differently? Aisha smiled. No. Because in that exact moment, I learned that calmness can be the strongest punch in the world. That afternoon, she drove along the Hudson River. The scenery drifted past like a slow reel of film. She thought back to her early years, a girl from Detroit, underestimated, in every meeting, interrupted mid-sentence, always having to speak louder just to be heard. But now she no longer needed to raise her voice. The world was listening. Her phone rang. The name appeared, Grant Whitmore. She hesitated, then answered. Hello, Aisha. Grant's voice was deep and rough. I just wanted to tell you we've signed the transfer of the Whitmore Foundation's assets to your Dignity Initiative. Consider it our way of starting over. Aisha was silent for a moment before replying softly. Thank you. Not for the money, but for understanding. On the other end, Grant sighed. I'm not sure I understand power anymore. But I'm learning again. She smiled faintly and nodded even though he couldn't see her. Night fell. Aisha returned to her apartment on the 54th floor overlooking Times Square. The giant screen outside played footage from the press conference, her standing tall, speaking about dignity. Below it read the words, Dignity endures. She turned on a soft light and sat down. The emerald gown from that night still hung in its glass case, streaked with dark Bordeaux stains. She hadn't washed it, nor hidden it away. It was a keepsake, not of humiliation, but of strength forged from it. Closing her eyes, she felt her steady breath. There was no pride, only a profound calm, the kind only those who've been underestimated truly understand. The next morning headlines reported that Lydia Whitmore had stepped down from her position and joined a mentorship program for young women called Women Rise. One quote from her spread across social media. Sometimes to understand what true power is, you have to lose everything that once made you believe you had it. The world read those words, and only one woman smiled, Aisha Carter. That afternoon, she was back at the office of the Dignity Initiative. On her desk were hundreds of grant applications from women across America, women once overlooked, dismissed or pushed aside. She turned through the files until one name made her stop. Elena Brooks, single mother, former financial analyst. Aisha signed the approval form and smiled. People deserve opportunity, not pity. Outside sunset bathed Manhattan in gold. The fading light reflected off the glass windows, casting the silhouette of a woman at her desk, calm, focused, unadorned. Because now the world itself shone on her behalf. After every storm, what remains isn't ruin, but the seeds of change. And in a city where money often speaks louder than people, there are still those who choose to speak through dignity. The story of Aisha Carter did not end with revenge, but with awakening. She hadn't just saved herself, she had made the world look inward and realize, sometimes the one who seems weakest in the eyes of others is the only one who knows how to rise without hurting anyone. 1 month later, New York City had moved past the storm of public opinion, yet its echoes lingered in every cafe and every boardroom. The story of Aisha Carter was no longer breaking news, it had become a guiding light, Across business publications, new headlines began to appear. Major corporations restructure workplace culture after the Carter effect. The Dignity Initiative expands globally. Dignity, the new standard of 21st century leadership. In Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, a black CEO began his speech with these words: "Before we talk about technology or profit, I want to talk about respect. Thank you, Aisha Carter, the woman who reminded the world that power isn't given, it's kept through how we treat others." The audience erupted in applause. Among them sat some of the very same people who once shared a table with Lydia Whitmore at the Hudson Crown Gala. Now they sat in silence, listening. No one spoke, but they all understood they were witnessing the shift of an era. In Detroit, Aisha's hometown, a 17-year-old girl named Janelle wrote her scholarship essay. When I watched the clip of her standing tall after someone poured wine over her, I realized you don't need to shout to prove your worth. I want to become like her, a woman who changes how people see women of color. That essay went viral, becoming a symbol of a new generation, growing up confident, unafraid to embrace their identity. Meanwhile, Aisha's Dignity Initiative opened offices in London, Nairobi, and Mumbai. The Women Rebuild program, a fund supporting businesswomen who had faced discrimination, received over 5,000 applications in just 2 weeks. Major corporations began signing commitments to a zero-tolerance policy against public humiliation or discrimination at events. Forbes published an editorial titled, "Aisha Carter didn't just change finance, she made giants relearn how to treat people." That night in her apartment, overlooking the Hudson River, Aisha sat on the balcony with her notebook open before her. She wrote a few simple lines. "The world didn't change because of me. It changed because people saw themselves in me." A soft breeze carried the salty scent of the river. Down below, a digital billboard glowed with the words, "Dignity is the new power." She looked down at the city, a faint smile on her lips. Not the smile of victory, but of someone watching the seeds she planted begin to bloom. Across the ocean, Lydia Whitmore stood on stage at the Women Rise conference in Los Angeles. Gone was the silver gown. Gone were the dazzling lights. She was simply a woman ready to tell her story. That day, Lydia said, "I thought I was teaching someone about power. But in truth, I was the one who needed to learn. I learned that lesson from the woman I once hurt, and I'm grateful she chose not to take revenge, but to help me see myself." The audience of young women fell silent, then rose to their feet in applause. After the talk, a reporter asked, "Do you think Aisha Carter has forgiven you?" Lydia gave a sad smile. Maybe she never needed to, because she never let herself be dragged down to where I was. Later that evening in the Dignity Initiative office, Aisha received an envelope. No return address, only a small note inside. "Thank you for not seeking revenge. LW." Aisha folded the note and placed it beside a framed photo of her first Vector Solutions team where it had all begun. She didn't need to respond. Night fell. She stepped out onto a balcony, the city shimmering like an ocean of stars. In the gentle wind, she could hear the faint sound of a violin moon river, the same melody from that fateful gala night. But now it wasn't the sound of humiliation. It was peace. She closed her eyes, letting the music drift through her, and whispered, "Sometimes true strength doesn't lie in changing the world, but in making the world look back at itself." And that night across the New York sky, a single shooting star streaked past, silent, yet so bright that no one could look away. 2 years after that fateful night, the world had changed. But no one had forgotten the evening at the Hudson Crown, the night when a woman didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten, and with just 5 calm words, brought an empire to its knees. Since then, Aisha Carter had become a symbol, not of feminism, nor of revenge, but of dignity, a kind of power that cannot be bought, cannot be faked, and cannot be taken away. This morning, in the glass-walled conference hall on the 62nd floor of the Vector building, sunlight spilled across her face. Aisha stood before hundreds of employees, the words behind her etched on the wall: "Lead with dignity, win with purpose." "We can't change how others behave," she said, her voice low, yet filled with strength. "But we can change how the world responds to injustice, not with anger, but with resolve." The applause was thunderous, yet Aisha only smiled softly. Beneath the lights, she was no longer the woman who had wine poured on her at a gala. She was the one redefining the meaning of power. As the event ended, a reporter approached her. "Ms. Carter, if you could relive that night, would you do anything differently?" Aisha glanced toward the window where the golden sky of Manhattan shimmered and answered gently, "No. Because if I had responded with anger, they would have seen me as weak. But by staying silent, I made them face the noise inside themselves." Her words spread across social media. The press called it the Carter philosophy. Silence is not retreat, but the choice of someone who knows exactly where they stand. That afternoon, Aisha left the building and stepped into the street. The city was still as lively as ever, but now the billboards towering above displayed new faces, women of color, Asian and Latina, representing major corporations, charities, and global campaigns. A new generation was rising, and all of them in some way mentioned Aisha Carter as the one who had opened the first door. Across the country in Los Angeles, Lydia Whitmore, the woman who had once poured wine over Aisha, walked out of a community center. In her hands were documents labeled "Rebuilding Character Project." Her blonde hair was now cut short, her face bare of heavy makeup. She had just finished giving a talk to a group of students about the culture of apology in leadership. A young reporter followed her. "Ms. Whitmore, are you trying to redeem yourself?" Lydia paused, her eyes weary but honest. "I'm not redeeming myself. I'm learning to live with it and turn it into something that matters." She lifted her head, speaking slowly. "Back then I thought power meant making others bow. Now I understand real power is having the courage to bow before the truth." That night, Aisha returned to her quiet apartment by the Hudson River. The room was still filled only with the whisper of wind and the distant flicker of city lights. On the table inside, a glass case hung the same emerald gown, the Bordeaux stains still visible. But now they were no longer marks of shame. They were badges of endurance. Aisha poured a glass of water and lifted it toward the window, not to celebrate herself, but to honor the millions who had endured in silence, as she once had those who never got the chance to speak. For those who endured, she whispered, and for those who never will again. The next morning, the Wall Street Review published a feature article. 2 years after the Hudson Crown incident, Aisha Carter not only saved Vector Solutions from crisis, she ushered in a new era, one where dignity is the true measure of value, not money. The piece ended with a single line. "In a world deafened by the noise of power, It was Aisha's silence that resonated the loudest. One evening she visited her mother in a small house on the outskirts of Detroit. The elderly woman greeted her with a warm embrace. "You've made the whole world see that silence can be strength," her mother said. Aisha smiled. "I only did what you taught me. Don't argue with someone who's shouting. Just look at them long enough, and they'll hear themselves." The two sat together on the porch, watching the sun set. No more words were needed. Everything was already clear. Aisha's legacy wasn't measured in buildings or wealth, but in how people treated one another after her. Later that night, before going to bed, Aisha opened a small keepsake box. Inside was the printed invitation to the Hudson Crown Gala, the very paper that had started it all. She folded it neatly, placed it in a frame, and wrote beneath it by hand. From one night of humiliation, a new era was born. Outside, the city stayed awake. But in her quiet room, Aisha Carter had found peace. Not because she had won, but because she had taught the world how to lose with dignity. 3 years after the night at the Hudson Crown, New York City had changed, not louder, just deeper. Stories of success were no longer only about profit, but about how people treated others once they had power in their hands. And at the center of that change was still the same name, Aisha Carter. This morning, Aisha stood in Washington, D.C., ready to address the Global Business Council. Inside the auditorium, hundreds of top executives sat in attentive silence. Outside, the media gathered as if witnessing a moment in history. She stepped onto the stage, composed and calm her face, carrying the gentle weariness of someone who had weathered many storms. The light reflected off a small metallic pin on her jacket, engraved with 2 simple words, "Dignity first." Her voice rose, soft but steady. 3 years ago, a glass of wine spilled over me and shook the market. But what truly shook the world was how people began to see dignity differently. They realized that respect isn't an obligation, it's the true measure of character. She paused, her gaze falling to the front row, where Lydia Whitmore sat quietly listening. No longer adversaries, no longer bound by resentment, just 2 people who had both once been wrong now, standing in the same room, united by a shared understanding. Power, Aisha continued, isn't measured by how many people fear you, but by how many still stand beside you when you've lost everything. The applause began softly, then swelled, rising like a tide. When the session ended, Lydia walked toward her. She smiled, a real smile, neither shy nor proud. "Thank you, Aisha," she said softly. "Because of you, I've learned that sometimes the only way to make amends is to live differently every day." Aisha placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder. "No one is defined forever by their mistakes, Lydia. What matters is how we choose to write the next chapter." Their eyes met, 2 women, 2 pasts sharing one present. Nothing more needed to be said. That afternoon, back at her hotel, Aisha sat by the window, watching the sun set over the White House. On the table lay the morning paper, its headline bold, "From Humiliation to a Global Movement." Beneath it, her smiling photograph captioned, "The woman who made the world listen through silence." Aisha read the words, then folded the paper gently. She didn't need more glory. What she needed was already here, a world learning to pause before causing harm. Evening came. On the rooftop terrace, a soft breeze moved through the air. Aisha looked out over the city, its lights stretching like an ocean of stars. She whispered to herself, "Dignity doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be lived every single day." Below, a massive digital billboard glowed with white letters. Dignity isn't loud, it lasts. Aisha smiled. There were no more storms, only the quiet peace of someone who had walked through one and left light behind. And so, from a single night of humiliation, Aisha Carter had planted a seed that would never die, the belief that true strength doesn't come from fighting back, but from standing firm in the storm without ever losing yourself. One autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted along Fifth Avenue, Aisha Carter walked through Central Park. She wore a long beige coat and held a cup of hot coffee in her hand. No bodyguards, no cameras, no flashing lights, only a woman who had completed a journey from being humiliated to becoming a symbol of human dignity. On a stone bench nearby, a boy of about 10 sat reading Time magazine. On its cover was Aisha's calm face, her bright eyes beneath a bold headline, "The Woman Who Taught the World to Listen." The boy looked up, recognizing her. You're Miss Aisha Carter, right?" She smiled and nodded. "I read your story," the boy continued, his voice innocent, yet sincere. "At school, they told us that you didn't take revenge on the person who hurt you. You helped them become better. I think that's the strongest way to win." Aisha gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you. You know, if more people understood, that sooner maybe the world would see a little less pain." That afternoon, she returned to the Dignity Initiative office. On the wall hung a world map covered in glowing dots, each representing a place her movement had reached over 60 countries, 500 projects, and thousands of women and children trained, protected, and given opportunities. She gazed at the lights, tiny stars against the dark background, and knew that this was the most beautiful part of her story, that light could travel far without needing its source to hold it. That evening in New York, a grand event took place, the Change-Makers of the Decade ceremony. Aisha was the final speaker. When she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet, not for fame, but because they saw in her what the world longed for: calm amid chaos, compassion amid power. She began, her voice steady. 3 years ago, someone poured wine over my head in front of hundreds of people. But the painful part wasn't the wine. It was the laughter. They laughed because they believed dignity could be taken away. Tonight, I stand here to tell you, no one can take away your dignity unless you hand it to them. She paused. The first claps broke the silence. Then hundreds, then thousands stood in ovation. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Aisha smiled softly, her voice deep and warm, resonating like the heartbeat of the room. We don't need revenge to be seen. We just need to live in a way that makes it impossible for others to ignore the light within us. As the stage lights dimmed, Lydia Whitmore, now the director of the Women Rise program, walked forward to present Aisha with a bouquet of white flowers. The two women embraced no past, between them only gratitude. A photographer captured the moment. The photo spread across the world, titled, "Forgiveness on Stage. Forgiveness on the Stage of Humanity." That night, Aisha returned to her apartment by the Hudson River. The city outside still glowed its lights, rippling across the shimmering water. She sat by the window and wrote the final words in her old notebook. I didn't change the world. I just chose not to let the world change me. And maybe that's how one woman can make the whole world listen. She closed the notebook and smiled. The night wind swept through, carrying the faint salt of the river and the quiet warmth of countless souls still learning to rise, calm, kind, and unbroken. From the perspective of a leadership culture expert, the story of Aisha Carter is not merely the journey of a woman who was humiliated and later reclaimed her honor. It is proof that in a world where power is often defined by domination, dignity is the most enduring form of strength. Her power did not come from raising her voice, but from her ability to make the entire world fall silent and listen. In the very moment she chose not to retaliate, she transformed vulnerability into a timeless lesson about character and integrity. Aisha did not win through revenge, but by forcing those who once humiliated her to see their own smallness reflected in her composure. She reminds us that sometimes silence is not weakness, but the wisdom of those who understand their true worth. In an era where social media and power often walk hand in hand with noise, her journey stands as a reminder for all of us choose to stand tall, even when the world bows down. If you believe that dignity remains the guiding light amid the darkness of ambition, click like subscribe to the channel to help spread stories of resilience and humanity. And before you go, leave a comment that reflects your belief in this message. Hold your dignity.